I want to move into a little bit more of a definition of of what are considered, really, for lack of a better word, four claims about psychopathy that people look at and say these. You talk about it in five different buckets,
Yeah.
and there are three in particular that you really kind of hone in on. Can you summarize those real quick and just help us understand what those in the PCLR system are the primary focuses of a definition of psychopathy?
So there are five claims that are framed as evidence-based claims, and they are that people who are have high psychopathy, they are extraordinarily dangerous. So they are the worst of the worst. That's the first one. The second one is that they are untreatable, incorrigible. There's nothing you can do. They will remain extraordinarily dangerous for the rest of their lives, which is, of course, very different from ordinary, average, justice-involved individuals, where age is highly correlated with crime, for example. The third one is that they have some sort of moral psychological deficit, whether it's a lack of empathy, an inability to perceive moral values, and so on and so forth. Right. So there's this idea that we're dealing with this extreme type of psychology, that we have evidence to say that. The other two is that the psychopathy has a biological foundation. That it's a brain-based disorder that leads to these traits and behaviors. And the second one is that they claim that we have a fairly good understanding of what is going on. In other words, to use a scientific word, we have a good theory, or just to use the lay person, is that we have a good explanation for what is actually going on, right? Those are the five major claims that are made about psychopathy. But it's important to emphasize that they were early on in the 1990s presented as evidence-based claims, so that there were empirical evidence to support these claims, these inferences that we make. And it should be fairly uncontroversial today as a scientist to look at that evidence base and say that is just no longer the case. Like, it is not the case that people who score high in the PCLR are extraordinarily dangerous, that they're untreatable, and they have some sort of mysterious moral incapacity, and so on and so forth. It's just simply not there in the literature. That is, it's not some fringe view. This is like the main message that you take from all meta-analysis, systematic reviews that's been published in the past, like, basically 2 decades, if you will, like that. It's kind of always been the message as soon as the research started to proliferate. This is the odd tension there is between what's being claimed and the empirical evidence at the end of the day, right?
Well, where it also gets a little troubling is that even after the work is done to explain that discrepancy, the earlier studies are still getting referenced, and nobody's coming in and saying this is wrong. These labeling is still happening. Why is that the case if there's a better understanding?
Yeah, it's something that I truly struggle with understanding myself. I don't like, and I think it's quite rare to find this sort of behavior among scientists in the sciences in general. Science is supposed to correct itself, right? And science is usually, I mean, no, I know this is the fairy tale story, but we're usually pretty good at looking at the evidence to say, I was wrong, and now I'm going to change, And something is just not, that correction is not happening here. It's the evidence base is clearly suggesting, let's just take a claim like that people with a psychopathy diagnosis are extraordinarily dangerous. It's just not there. If you look at risk prediction studies, when we take individuals, we often do it in a controlled setting, right, where we take individuals with a high PCLR score and people with a lower. So usually the threshold is 30 out of a 40 score, right? So that's the diagnostic threshold. When we compare these two groups and their future recidivism rates, they're not identical, but they're very close to being identical. The difference is so small that you can actually only really measure it reliably by actually doing the math. Like to look through, let's say we took a group of psychopathic persons in group A and non-psychopathic persons group B, and then they had been sent out in society, and then 5 years later we call them back into our office, and then we say, hey, everybody put on a red T-shirt if you did something criminal in the past 5 years, and then both group would put on red T-shirts. You would not be able to look at these two groups with your naked eye and say clearly this group to the left or right has more red T-shirts on. That's how small the difference is.
Wow. Okay.
Which puts it in a little bit in context, right? So, but yeah.
So the question about this happens, I'm assuming that some number of the people that have come in and are going through the PCLR have committed some type of a crime. There is now a search for an explanation for why they created this crime. And then ones may or may not be. But the question starts coming up of how they get treated when they're in the criminal justice system. If they are diagnosed with psychopathy, then how they are treated and, as you mentioned, managed through the system takes an entirely different track. Whereas they may have conducted the crime and they're not being punished for the crime, but how they get managed in the system based on this diagnosis is actually where the real rub is.
That is where, as you put it, where the real rub is. There's a little caveat to all this, because I don't want to make it sound like as soon as you have this label, everything is like it's all going to be about that label and nothing else, right? But we know from all sorts of studies that we kind of find evidence when we, for example, interview judges or parole board people on the parole board. We kind of get a lot of like good evidence to suggest that this label here has a very heavy weight on their decision making relative to other lines of information. For example, let me just give you a quick example.
Please.
There was my colleague just published a recent study. It's my colleague Phil Madeo, who from here from 2025, where they have interviewed dozens of judges, and they asked them what sort of information is like, what are you looking for when you have to make decisions about sentencing or probation and things like that. And what they look a lot for, and this was a common theme across judges, is they look for whether a person can change, whether they will benefit from rehabilitation. So that's a general theme. Okay, so here comes Paul with his psychopathy diagnosis, and that is an inference to that you are not going to change. That's what we infer from that. Like, so you see here, like, it's not true. It's simply just not true that you cannot change, that you cannot benefit from rehabilitation program. All evidence suggests you benefit in exactly the same ways than everybody else does, right? But the judge is now being told by an expert that since you have this label, that thing that he or she is kind of evaluating whether you can change, that's not going to happen.
They're unfixable.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to the PCLR, I think that we have also gotten to believe that psychopathy is a brain-based disorder, and that if we did an MRI or an fMRI scan, that there is going to be something visible that we're seeing that's wrong inside the brain. But that's actually also not holding water, is it?
No, and it's not for the lack of trying. We actually have a good number of all sorts of neurological studies, right? So what we usually go for today is MRI technology, so magnetic resonance imaging, and we can do imaging of the structure of a person's brain. We can also do functional based studies where we get data from how different areas of the brains are activated during certain tasks, right? So we have done dozens and dozens of studies of these, probably a little bit above 100 studies counting right now, and results has just been all over the place. There's no like consistent patterns that has been found. Early on, there was a lot of enthusiasm for this idea that the people have probably heard this who are listening, that there was this idea that psychopathic person had this deform or deficit or impairment in the amygdala, which is heavily involved in emotional processing. Amygdala is involved in many things, but also in emotions. And that evidence was all reviewed a couple of years ago in a very, very systematic way by my colleague, Philip Deming. And the conclusion is that no, there's just no consistent evidence. Most of the times when we do this, what we get is null findings. In other words, that there's no differences between psychopathic persons and non-psychopathic persons.